Okay. Thanks, Joe. Uh, all right. 13, Friday the 13th. Welcome to Dis and Dat. Um, we're trying to finish up here on the uh, rent and financialization of water section of an article that I began with yesterday on Soren Mao, who writes a new and interesting book. I think one that will, I think, at least get people to become more invigorated about certain humanist approaches to Marx. I think the test will be, and I'm not sure it was tested. I think he's on the job market too, which also amused me from another perspective. But anyway, Soren Mao and Heinrich would be an interesting conversation to just see whether that's happened. I'm sure he's had a conversation. Mao being in Denmark, among other places in the EU. So anyway, let me get on with it. We were looking at, I introduced this with the idea that Soren Mao was asking a question online about the geological metaphors that Marx was sort of the geoscience metaphors that Marx was indulging. And of course, that's a kind of discourse analysis. I think that Soren Mao, engages in a fairly interesting and important way. I think it certainly, when you talk about the phenomena, and in the article that we were looking at in terms of rent, was a kind of one-sidedness, as it were, with thinking about the inner and the outer movements that go on in discussing these kinds of things like value. Value has an internal element and an external element. Now, even to talk about it as an internal or external thing, it's an abstract idea, gets us into a whole bunch of philosophical grounds, but it's a useful place to go. As you know, as we're looking at in another thing, a couple lectures ago about Merleau-Ponty and where Western Marxism may have gone wrong. It didn't go wrong. It just simply allowed us to have other kind of options that were important in the context of Diamat and a bunch of other things that were more orthodox versions of Marxism. And the reason why we look at Lasordo and a bunch of other folks is I think we begin to see the deeper, the sedimented, to use the geoscience analogy, you know, the the tectonic differences among Marxists, and they're actually fairly important. And it's not a matter of simply revisiting it or retconning Marxism or whatever. They are quite current, and they infest a contemporary discourse. So, if you're going to have a argument with someone about, for example, Ukraine and Russia, which we're going to have later on today, not an argument, but a conversation, I think, about other things in the current politics. You have to look at it with the mind that there are deep and surface structures. See, there another geologic analogy that we have to sort of think about. They're useful, but at some moment you have to get beyond or reifying those kinds of arguments. The unfortunate thing is that some of us get stuck in that. You could say, in fact, that the rent argument, value rent, kind of relation, value rent and finance thing can, on the one hand, it covers a whole bunch of stuff, which this article is really good for me anyway. It gives me all the subcategories that I had started adding elsewhere. And it is a useful place. This is Purcell, Loftus, and March in Progress in Human Geography, which talks about value, rent, and finance. So we plowed through the difference in rent, differential rent, absolute rent, and monopoly rent, all of which share certain things. You can't see them as discrete categories as much as some people do. Including Marxists, partially because it causes problems for the math. I would assume that's Basu's reason for doing it. But we're going to revisit Basu on rent, mainly because it sort of works for things he wants to do in terms of the Indian economy or within the global South. certain things, but other things you can't just do it that way because the global south has a range of sites of domination and exploitation, et cetera. The difference between the core and the periphery is also the difference between the city and the country, between the port city and the inland or the wilderness, and all those things, the things that make us interested in the Amazon, et cetera. So absolute rent is necessary, as pointed out, to deal with certain stuff like pollution, a whole bunch of things. And so anyway, we looked at finance and the financial elements to show that what Michael Hudson is doing is an important service to try and deal with the range of financialized, securitized, the financialization issues that gave us the crisis of 2007, 2008, which may return at some moment in the future, in a very brief future ahead, because of certain people's commitment to chaos, to create a chaotic capitalism, because you can indeed profit from it. Simple example, right? If you create enough doubt about, for example, vaccines, you're going to get situations where people are going to avoid getting vaccinated or getting their children vaccinated, which will raise the possibility, not necessarily of pandemics, but certainly of a rise in sickness, which will create a larger demand for medical services, from which profit will occur. So you have to sort of see this in its completeness, that supporting skepticism about things that are truly natural, in the sense that we've normalized our approach to regular vaccinations, which are kind of important. And of course, there are always risks with vaccination, but they're so small that that risk is relatively negligible. And with the rise in gene analytic gene analysis or genetic engineering, et cetera, mapping the genome has actually made this better. So to try and attack science on those kinds of bases, to create skepticism in order to promote demand for medical services, which I think we saw in the pandemic. But if you had to pay attention to see that was actually what was going on. Now you had two, kind of points of view on that, right? You create skepticism, which gets more people sick and more people die. But it is a certain kind of libertarian cynicism, as it were, a eugenic kind of cynicism that, they were going to die anyway, or that you should die. And unless you think I'm making that up, to have actual legislators say that those of us in a more geriatric stage of our life should die faster is why that guy is still in office is just fascinating to me. That alone should have gotten him impeached or thrown out of office, or at least not reelected. So we're at that weird point, and people who are cynical enough to ideologically move an entire nation into that kind of position. Now, that sounds like overgeneralizing and catastrophizing it, but the fact is that there's a significant part of a larger portion of the population who are more skeptical about government programs, particularly government programs related to health. And yes, there is a history of government programs that were terrible and created lots of harm, but there are more, from a benefit cost point of view, that are more beneficial. That anyway, I wax philosophic. The point I want to make is that financialization is built on the backs of that, because of the cost that we can see is totally different than the rest of at least the rest of the happier world. You see, if America is, just simply not as happy as Finland, there should be a reason why that is, and analyze it more carefully. All right. So financialization, it's not simply an abstract force, sui generis, doesn't morph into an analysis from explandum into explanans. So this is a complex set of determinations. I think that's the whole point of that what Marx was trying to deal with and what is identified in both this article and the other article attached on today's page is this question of scale, as I mentioned before, that in large numbers, the concept of the average is actually really important to think about. That Marx's goal, like many others during the latter half of the 19th century, was to think about trying to find more global solutions, trying to find more society level solutions. And as Marx identifies, among so many others, that there are differences, social formations, classes that have conflicts. And some of those conflicts are based on property, on land ownership, but on other kind of abstract status, landed gentry, those kinds of landed capital. So what is important to look at in terms of Marx is that he acknowledges that those sets of differences, but he's also a concern from a subjective point of view, that is to the revolutionary subject, which pretty important in the latter half of the 19th century, still important now. That revolutionary moments can occur. So, for example, Syria, government overthrown in 2 weeks. Now, there's incredible chaos there. There's Al Qaeda and ISIS and a bunch of other craziness, and you can see that even people who are relatively from that area of politics has tried to ensure that women have rights, and that's sort of a interesting thing to see at the front end, because they know that hegemonic powers will get really obsessed about, and for good reason, about a continued subjugation of women. But anyway, that's just interesting. But the fact is, it pretty much only a couple of weeks, and the bad guys who were there for decades are gone. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, you could say, well, there's hope for revolutionary behavior. On the other hand, you can see that it was the failure of a certain hegemonic power, the withdrawal of certain power, that made it go that way. So we're looking at a kind of a precise focus on the internally related moments comprising a range of different phenomena, from the wide range of enclosures now being enacted through land grabs to the transformation of public infrastructures into financial assets and the integration of social reproduction into the circulation of interest-bearing capital. This is a very loaded moment, and I think it's important to see that there is a growing band of global rentiers representing the motley group of urban rentiers. And if there's any easy explanation for what Trump is doing, and that, for example, there's a new Trump organization hotel in Saudi Arabia that's now being started. So it just seems to me that it's just there, and that it's no secret, and people should, probe their consciousness about these matters. So identifying from where and how this motley group, including Trump, has emerged requires a reappraisal of the circuits of value extraction in the form of rents within the global economy. Appropriation of rents may not be central to all forms of financialization. Nevertheless, an analysis of rents is crucial when seeking to understand how revenue streams can be securitized and sold on as interest-bearing capital through landed and institutional barriers of private monopoly over resources. This is the whole business there, and it becomes all too integrated when, Trump celebrates his image on the cover of Time magazine, which is not, it's a unique phenomenon, but on the other hand, he shares it with Hitler and Stalin, and, there's, Khomeini and other folks. So being on the cover of Time magazine is a very rather trivial sort of thing, but sufficiently a obsessive goal that Trump has at his various golf courses, mock-ups of non-existent Time magazine covers with Man of the Year on it. And if there's any good example of a cult of personality, that's just simply one of them. And because Trump is aesthetically deprived or depraved, sometimes he just buys really bad socialist realism stuff. And that's why he promotes those trading cards. Anyway, back to our, but they've become financialized as NFTs, needless to say. So we're right back at financialization. And it is a sense of enclosure. Similarly, what Trump is currently doing with his Bitcoin enterprise, as well as his own social media platform, and all of which are, you know, eventually going to go bankrupt. But, needless to say, he's going to make money during that period. And this is the point of financialization, is that you're making money even though you're going to build it off of a whole system of failures. That's the whole catastrophizing. The reason why you have a pandemic, for example, is to sort of clear the market in a kind of insidious sort of way to to create new markets, new audiences, etc. So that it's just the same business. Capitalism just keeps going on. Rent clearly predates the onset of financialization. As a social form through which value moves is captured and distributed, the social relation manifest in rents extends back to the feudal area, emerging, however, as a more specific social relation with the transition to capitalism. The rise to dominance of finance has nevertheless opened up new opportunities to appropriate surplus value removed from payments for the use of land. Let me stop there and say, this is kind of what goes on, right? You have land grabs, but then again, you have whole secondary markets built on the land grabs. If you grab more land, you're going to have to insure the land, right? There's just stuff that goes on with property that are part of the financialization of things. And this is what you play with. You take equity and you do other things with it. And this is fictitious capital. This is what David Harvey is talking about in a very generalized way, but in more specific ways. And that's what this article is about. Purcell, et cetera, et al. Indeed, even a cursory review of the financialization of food, agriculture, and land grabbing literature suggests that rents play a huge, under-researched role in the transformation of socio-ecologies. So, seen in this light, the novelty of financialization lies less in a structural transformation of capital accumulation, or the new forms of value production and capital accumulation are often equated with the term. Now, these trends can be read as financialization's form of appearance. And so we have this difference between, substance and appearance, essence and appearance, style and substance. All of these dichotomies are at work, not unlike Donald's hair. Instead, the novelty of financialization, when mediated by financial products that permit the hands-off ownership of land resources and infrastructures, may well lie in the penetration of rent extraction mechanisms into new spheres of social reproduction and everyday life. Epistone's terms, the crisis of value production is masked by the financially mediated attempt to transform more and more dimensions of life into the raw materials of price and profit, into forms of purported wealth that supposedly will guarantee ever more complex so-called financial instruments, as if such wealth were independent of value in capitalism. And that's often what you get when somebody tries to sell you, for example, insurance, taking out annuities on things, and or on services, which is the kind of subscription service model that we have going on. So the financialization of water is similar to this in the sense that we have a natural resource, but we have it guided in a variety of ways, whether it's building a dam, rerouting water courses, the damming issue, that is the damming of river sources to create sinks or reservoirs of water supplies, is a really important concept, very key infrastructure development, which changes the nature of all kinds of things. It's agriculture downstream and et cetera, et cetera. So you have all kinds of stuff at work. Nevertheless, each is vague when it comes to the relation between value and financialization. And so you have replicating the problem at various levels, as Purcell et al. Talk about the efflorescing profits realized within this distinctive phase of the political economy of water. So what what happens further on here is a little bit more specific to the UK in terms of how water is billed, how certain profits are estimated, the rent capture relative to the water supply. The problem of water, of course, is not only simply the supply of water, but of course the treatment of water, the problem of sewage, and goes all the big problems for England were probably late to the 19th century treatment, the hygienic treatment of water. So rent capture related to that, highly institutionalized or at least class determined. And it's clearly important that much of that got centralized, or some of it was engaged at a privatized level, but eventually the state takes it over. And then, of course, it becomes devolved in our more neoliberal era. I've oversimplified it, of course, in the post-war era, to, certain institutional utilities. The Brits don't use the concept of utility, and certain elements of the business model are different from the American. So the discussion here is more specific to British treatment and dealing of water supply and its and sewage treatment. But the fact is, the same topological space of finance exists, and it is opaque. In the America, we have utility districts often. It depends on the structure of state level government, but they're not identical, and they are problematized in a variety of ways, because public utilities are on the one hand capital entities, on the other hand, they are cartels. They are a system of contracts and treaties, or as it were, a bunch of other things. As was often quoted to me, and I don't think it exists anymore, is that the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power owned water rights all the way up to Canada, which is an overstatement of the issue. But current studies, discuss it in that kind of interstate sort of way. And so it's an interesting sense that while we have utility policy, they're not quite done in the same way that interstate commerce is. And so in a pre-socialist economy, we actually have more of these kinds of glitches in the system that one can profit from, certainly from an investor's point of view in terms of financialization. But they do not necessarily give us the benefits, the necessary public benefits that a quote unquote public utility would provide. The Brits don't call them that, which is, conceptually an interesting problem. And hence, this article deals with it more from the rent extraction point of view, and that these rent extractions are, sort of fictitious capital operating using rents. And they use water revenue streams in both senses and water prices in terms of monopoly rent. And so all of this, therefore, rather than the financial processes having little connection to the operational side of the business, by unpacking the feedback loop between these two processes, we can better identify the monopoly power and rent extraction that masquerades as value creation while underpinning the rent-based redistribution of value that favors investors over customers and households. Now, in one sense, you could say, well, you can't help but do that because, there's land there, and there's pipes and stuff, and it has to be dealt with on a more regional or local level. And there are different companies, and et cetera, et cetera. It just gets into this weird morass, no different from a network point of view than, having Brit Rail and then all of these regional rail companies. And the difference, of course, being is that if you had more control in a certain region, it has more commuters, let's say, you can make bigger profits than off the national network. Not everyone is taking the train for work to Edinburgh every day, or whatever. So these are the kinds of things that go on. So formation of water prices, monopoly rent, I won't go through the details of this, but they use various formulas, very similar to, in the American context, to Ramsey pricing and other stuff. It is a similar model and a problematic model that we see exacerbated in current issues about discussing, for example, transit policy in the United States. So the price congestion um, uh, uh, congestion pricing models are similar but different between the two countries. And you know, in one sense, people in the U.S., more specifically in New York City, are trying to replicate some elements of the price congestion model produced in London. Doesn't quite work the same way, although it does have the same structural similarity. But the problem is, or whatever, that's for another probably lecture, but it is the methodological differences are there, and that's what Ofwat and a variety of other things in the British context are different in that sense. So productivity improvements are different. While appearing to mimic competition, price cap regulation hides a set of political decisions as well as masking the capture of monopoly rents. That's similar to the congestion pricing that is going to go into place in New York City, for example, because who legislates the price congestion? You know, whatever, it's the Port Authority, right, or the separate whatever the hell it is, the state or the region. And this is a monopoly pricing. Monopoly rents are going to be derived from that. And yes, of course, it affects different people in different ways. Some people have to drive a truck into Manhattan every day just simply because the terminal from which you get stuff, you know, requires that you do that. Whereas if you're a commuter, you know, and if you're a rich commuter, it doesn't matter to you because you just drive in or you have your driver deal with this problem. But for other people, those in the middle, you'll have a various set of pricing issues that go on in terms of your budget, blah, 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 right? So water catchment and abstraction is this whole question of transformation of stuff, of natural things turned into capital, like water, become important. And so predating the most recent wave of financialization, these rents are clearly acknowledged within the mainstream literature, both the Cave Report and subsequent efforts to develop second-generation regulation. Therefore, to seek to counter the formation of rents within vertically integrated monopolies. So, you know, that your water company is a vertically integrated monopoly. I mean, you pay your bill to them. They, you know, deal with pretty much everything up to the sink or up to the curb. And note that up to the curb is actually an interesting question or problem, considering how electricity and telecommunications is also, you know, this sort of network product that's kind of a problem in the same rent seeking. Water is an uncooperative commodity. Indeed, it is uncooperative because of weather, because of flooding, because of all kinds of other stuff that, you know, shear borders, source, problem of exit, problem of treatment, problem of government. Both Cave and Stern's proposals for second wave generation seek to force water to cooperate. Well, you know, as we can see in Florida, doesn't quite do that. Thus, an independent monopoly price is created as an expression of a highly political process. Its very existence and magnitude acquire the character of monopolies, protected from competition, and are able to extract rent for the benefit of shareholders. And that's the difference between you and I going out, digging for a well, finding a well that is a unique water source because of, you know, the water table and blah, 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 blah. You know, you set up your own little water company. Well, there'll be issues if you try to do that and try to create a market for your well. And often that is the issue, isn't it? You know, the Beverly Hillbillies finding oil. It is similar to that. In fact, fracking could be analogized to the Beverly Hillbillies in some way. But anyway, the ultimate clients, households, right, the curb, underwrite the profitability of the asset. Greco captures this process well, albeit in a different context, writing that long-term water licenses can generate rent insofar as property titles quantify and thus justify in exact forms their price on water markets. Approaching things from this angle problematizes the connections between valuation processes and value itself from a political economic perspective. Rent is therefore the materiality behind the valuation process, which underpins the commodification of water. So just even mentioning it as materiality is that problematic element when we talk about financialization. It's just money. Well, it's not just money. Money constantly reflects something else. And, this value question is part of that, but nature is part of that as well. So the connection between all of these is why we have an ecological discourse. And without getting into the idea of revenue correction mechanism, which is similar to Ramsey pricing in the US, you can see that similarly, taking place every 5 years, the last two pricing reviews have occurred against the backdrop of the financial crisis, and when it was assumed that financing costs would rise in coming years. However, on the back of quantitative easing, which occurs in the US as well, is global, and historically low interest rates, utilities have reaped large profits from price cap regulation based on incorrect assumptions over the cost of capital. And lest you think that's unimportant, I would argue that we get similar issues in network provision of telecommunication stuff, electronics, electrical signals. Similarly, you have things that operate like price cap and that are problematic. Some of which would not justify, rationalize perhaps, eradication or liberating the FCC, the FEC, the FTC. The whole goal of neoliberal kind of fiddling, monkey business, is to liberate these kind of constraints so that people can make bigger profits regardless of the activity. And there is something shared among all these things, considering that they are operating not in a perfectly competitive market. And the claim to make them more competitive is just, it's one thing, but it is truly another when you think of it as a more global phenomenon. So such serious misjudgments demonstrate that the regulator is deeply compromised. And then, it goes into a thing on Thames Water, the ability of firms to pay back debts built on securitized water bills requires a highly predictable regulatory environment. And so, in other words, you need to, constant profits need to be, are important as well. So you do have this sense of, well, what's going on here? Why are price controls in there? Price controls are necessary in that particular sense. On the one hand, it guarantees profits for certain institutions, highly vertically integrated, and some less vertically integrated or lesser. And you see this paradoxical situation. The high debts of water companies serve as one of the best defenses against tighter regulation. In summary, owing to the system of regulation, unit pricing of water does not correspond to its value. Rather, the pricing process conceals the formation of monopoly rent. Monopoly rent is because they can charge you whatever the hell they want. Whoever your water supplier is, whether it's a city, whether it's a region, whether it is a firm. So water's biophysical, unique, and non-substitutable character mitigates, unless you're saving rainwater, etc., mitigates price competition and market exchange, resulting in vertically integrated monopolies that exercise control from water abstraction to the household tap. And this is no different from an economics point of view. This is standard economics. This is very orthodox. Not, the heterodox folks use the same models. The problem, of course, is who owns what. These monopoly conditions establish a social value, that is a market price, above individual value, that is prices of production, ensuring the profitability of the most expensive and debt-laden providers. In addition, as explained above, property rights created by the divestiture of water infrastructure imitate the class barrier posed by landed property over natural resources, and therefore suggest the further institutional existence of absolute rents. So the Saudis were taking advantage in Arizona of, the relative flexibility of the whole setup and are able to grow the alfalfa that they need for their horses and camels and blah, blah, blah in Arizona. And transport prices are sufficiently low enough at volume to, do all this there, yet to provide the stuff that they need without investing in infrastructure that they could do in other parts of Africa. But then that would mean development. It would mean blah, 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 a variety of things. And so it's actually cheaper and more profitable for them to do it here. Now, that's not to say, that this is sort of a xenophobic sort of deal about Saudis own all kinds of crap in the United States. And it would be just interesting to see what that map looks like, considering that they do own certain parts of our government. And so the next section is on absolute rent. It's the idea that prices are much less flexible, fluid, whatever. And in short, a class of rentiers creates financialized absolute rent under the facade of the regulator's attempt to introduce, quote unquote, competition. So you see this fictive version of competition. And in fact, the government in the American government, antitrust activity by the Department of Justice and, of course, by other regulatory agencies complicates the problem for these same things that I was just talking about, whether it's electricity, electronic signals, telecom signals, water. All of these things have exactly the same sets of problems. And from a kind of Koch brothers right-wing point of view, all of these things are just impediments to making more money, and particularly money at the margin of where profit is, where surplus value comes from. So there is a conclusion to all this. In her brilliant critique of marginalist economics, Mariana Mazzucato, quotes Oscar Wilde, a cynic is one who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The resurgence of interest in value theory would seem to challenge such cynics, reasserting that value matters. Remember, that value is an abstraction that tries to account for more of these kinds of things rather than being disintegrated into specificity, enclosures, as it were, isolated, price markets. Pricing markets. Nevertheless, the process of financialization in which the profits reaped by a burgeoning financial sector seem to far outstrip those of a real economy appears to suggest that in all the excitement over value theory, some Marxists have missed the point. Brett Christophers, is therefore right to suggest that it might be worth the risk in interrogating value theory when it comes to questions of finance. Nevertheless, in rising to this challenge, we come to somewhat different conclusions. These conclusions arise from our interrogation of the literature on the financialization of water. We're almost to the end. While accepting that the labors involved in producing fungible globules of risk can indeed be seen as generative of value, we're not convinced that this is sufficient explanation for the super profits. Super profits that, like super imperialism, now witnessed in the water sector and paid out in dividends by several of the largest utilities in England and Wales. Instead, we argue that value and finance need to be understood through their internal relations to an immediate moment, that of rent. So rent is more measurable in this particular context, and therefore we can see things that are happening to capital like expropriation. We don't want to talk about it necessarily as exploitation, but it certainly is extraction of something. And you don't even have to go to exploitation, but you can see from a property point of view, and particularly from a social justice point of view, that is, why is it that poor people have crappier water than rich people? Thus, we've advanced a conceptual framework that explores the value, rent, finance triad, permitting an exploration of the different ways in which rent enters into the circulation and accumulation of value in these financial times. In particular, we focused on the monopoly rents made possible from the uncooperative commodity that is water, and the absolute rents that emerge from the securitization of future revenue streams on the basis of which financial intermediaries generate fees and commissions charged to investors for accessing the liquid assets that infrastructural forms have become. Recalling the above injunction to think about rent beyond the land It is the creation of financial absolute spaces of private property relations around infrastructure assets that is essential to the way in which rent is pursued by fictitious capital formation. While our focus has been on water, predominantly water infrastructure, we suggest that such a framework has a wider resonance in that it challenges the black boxing of financialization, as something that Hudson brings up, thereby enabling a more analytic, precise understanding of the relations currently reconfiguring our socio-ecological worlds. So, it's kind of soft pedaling the eco-socialism, but really it is about eco-socialism ultimately. It still gets us back there. And I am at the end of my time allocated, but I urge you to, if you're at all interested in this stuff, read this somewhat more carefully, because this, for me, is at least they've identified some of the sub-examples, some of which I've sort of thrown at you, and is helps establish the plane of research, the way in which we can talk about the virtual similarities of certain network economies, and that transcends national or regional difference, is not absolute, although absolute rent is a term in this particular set of ideas. But it would seem to me that when Marx was talking about absolute, he meant something slightly different. But the concept, the kind of monopoly capital concept, is still important, despite its source in a certain point of view that is 20th century and not 21st century. We can't or ignore it, and in fact, it may make a kind of comeback. It's always been there, actually. The analysis has always been there. Some people have chosen to neglect it for a variety of reasons, whether it was intersectional, obsessions, the reactionary work of, it's reactionary work of revisionists, to use some communist terms. That's kind of what it was. So let me stop there. Let me thank you for your attention. Let me see if there's any uncooperative commodities out there. Thames Water. Yes, thank you, Lane. It is problematic, and adopting the American situation is that's a good example of what I was just yakking about. And then cholera, yes, because cholera is blind to class. Water treatment and sewage was managed in the mid 1800s, thanks to Lancaster and Engels, but also the Crown gets involved in this. This is sewers were on the mind of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Prince Albert and the Can. So all of these things were at work at the same time. Yes, the crazy, etc. Yes, all of these things, pandemics, indeed. Public comms captured by corporate controls, techno-feudalism, we're there at all of these, and it is happening. It's very current. This is not, an idle, anachronistic concept or model, and I think, virtually speaking, you can see that the treatments are very similar, and they resemble each other in a variety of ways. So, for example, the demand for coal or lignite or whatever the hell you want to call it, it's conditioned by that. It has locational issues. That is, you're more willing to build a coal-fired power plant than put in a nuclear one. And noting, of course, that nuclear is not a good option, a substitute in that same way. But yet, and of course, what you want to look at is how long does it take to build one of any of these? How long does it take to get it online? Relative to substitution, its relation to the land issue of where renewable energy comes from, whether it's solar or geothermal or wind. And then, of course, there's the transmission line problem, which is actually pretty important when you look at distance versus power versus technology versus blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, you note that there are other things that are occurring at the same pace, which require more planning, right? Google or Amazon or whatever are building power plants. And they're going to become utilities, and maybe public utilities relative to a region. So you need to think about, well, now we have new ways in which we can think about the market, and then we think about the market for hydrogen, similar to the problem that we encountered much earlier on with the subsidy of agriculture, sort of folded over into ethanol production, which allowed us not to go to electric vehicles, but rather to say, oh, well, we're doing our part because 10% of my gasoline is alcohol. So, all of that stuff is going on. I'll stop there. Let me bail from the, I don't know if I have the power. Joe, if you're there,